happen budget-wise? I mean, is there any effect to this vote? It's not going to happen in the Senate.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, it's not going to happen in the Senate, but it is important to let the American people know where you stand.
Discussion from today's Washington Journal, now back to live coverage of the U.S. House.
Recognition. Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 5986.
Clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 5986, a bill to amend the African Growth and Opportunity Act to extend the third country fabric program and to add South Sudan to the list of countries eligible for designation under that act, to make technical corrections to the harmonized tariff schedule of the United States relating to the textile and apparel rules of origin for the Dominican Republic Central American United States Free Trade Agreement, to approve the renewal of import restrictions contained in the Burmese Freedom and Democracy Act of 2003 and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Camp, and the gentleman from Washington, Mr. McDermott, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I urge passage of this legislation to strengthen trade and investment ties with Africa and the CAFTA-DR countries and support well-paying jobs in the United States. The legislation also extends the President's authority to impose the import ban on products from Burma for an additional 3 years and reauthorizes the actual imposition of the import sanctions for 1 year. The legislation has broad bipartisan support and is supported by all stakeholders. AGOA has succeeded in deepening trade and investment ties with sub-Saharan Africa and underscoring U.S. commitment to the region. The apparel industry has been a major driver of employment growth in Africa under AGOA. In Lesotho alone, jobs in the textile and apparel industry have more than doubled, growing from 19,000 to 45,000 because of AGOA. This bill extends the third country fabric provisions, which are vital to ensuring the continued success of the AGOA program, and ensures that the new Republic of South Sudan is eligible to benefit from AGOA. Under the CAFTA-DR trade agreement, trade has grown substantially. And since the implementation of this agreement, the trade deficit the United States previously had with these countries has turned into a trade surplus. Today's legislation builds upon that success by further improving the agreement's textile rules of origin. These changes encourage greater use of U.S. inputs in the CAFTA-DR countries, which supports U.S. jobs and improves trade and integration in our hemisphere. In 2003, Congress passed the Burmese Freedom and Democracy Act, which included an import ban on products of Burma renewable once a year for a total of 3 years. The law has been extended twice. This legislation extends the President's authority to impose the import ban for an additional 3 years and reauthorizes the actual import sanctions for 1 year. Now, I want to acknowledge the positive developments in Burma over the last year, but much work remains ahead with respect to political and economic reforms, human rights, the release of political prisoners, freedom of speech, press, association, as well as religion, and the treatment of ethnic groups within the country, all factors required for full termination of the import sanctions and other restrictions in the 2003 law. I encourage the Burmese government to continue its current reforms and commence others to fully address the concerns that led Congress to pass the 2003 law. For all of these reasons, we urgently need to pass this important legislation. I urge all of my colleagues to support this bipartisan legislation, and Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time is reserved. Gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of this bill, which extends expiring provisions of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, adds the country of South Sudan to a list of countries eligible for trade preferences, and implements technical fixes for the CAFTA agreement and renews the Burma sanctions. The expiring third country fabric provision is the cornerstone of AGOA and one of the most valuable parts of our trading relationship with Africa. Tens of thousands of workers and hundreds of companies depend on this provision. It is critical that we extend it now before it expires next month. We have delayed this extension for a year, and this unnecessary delay has cost thousands of jobs and millions in investment. It has hurt progress in Africa. We could have avoided this senseless job losses here and in Africa. I introduced the legislation to extend third country fabric and add South Sudan over a year ago. The delay was just politics, and we're unfortunately in an era where common sense things can't get done. As usual, the political games accomplished nothing. AGOA itself was truly bipartisan. We all worked together to compromise it and get a good thing done. That was a different era. At least today's vote will reflect some of the bipartisanship that has been a hallmark of AGOA from the start. The bill also adds South Sudan to the list of AGOA-eligible countries. South Sudan deserves every opportunity and every vote of confidence we can muster. This package also contains important technical fixes for CAFTA textiles. That's from Central America. The fixes that businesses and workers have been waiting for since February of last year. I also am pleased that we are evolving our policy for Burma. Burma has made important steps in the last 18 months, but there's still a long way to go. I'm particularly pleased with the investment transparency measures that the State Department has put forward. They are innovative, common sense, and exactly what investors and American public needs and expect. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time is reserved. Gentleman from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield to the distinguished chairman of the Trade Subcommittee, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Brady, such time as he may consume.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I join my colleagues in strongly supporting passage of this important bipartisan legislation to deepen trade ties with the sub-Saharan Africa and the Central American Dominican Republic countries and renew sanctions on Burma. As Chairman Camp pointed out, this legislation is strongly supported by America's textile industry and will help build more integrated supply chains between the United States and both Africa and Central America, maximizing the benefits of the agreements we describe as AGOA and CAFTA-DR. These provisions support well-paying U.S. jobs and jobs in sub-Saharan Africa and Central America. I was honored to help lead with Chairman Camp the effort to pass CAFTA-DR, and I'm very pleased now to see this successful agreement be further improved through the legislation we are considering today. This bill also extends the President's authority to continue the import ban under the 2003 Burmese Freedom and Democracy Act. I am not normally a fan of unilateral sanctions, but I believe these programs must be evaluated carefully to determine their effectiveness and implications for America's economy, and this does. I also recognize that as the sole remaining superpower, we have the responsibility to show our disapproval of rogue states and human rights abusers. The sanctions regime under the 2003 law is a model in this regard, and I can say that recent developments in Burma confirm the need for continuous evaluation. Although the Burmese government has taken many positive steps, these reforms must continue and grow so the citizens of Burma can gain true political and economic freedom. The goal is very much at the heart of the original 2003 law. For that reason, I believe we should continue the current sanctions regime as the international community keeps a watchful eye on developments. At the end of the day, this is a jobs bill, and a bipartisan one at that. I urge my colleagues to support this essential legislation, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Speaker, I yield to the distinguished gentleman from New York, Mr. Rangel, such time as he may consume.
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure hearing the word knocked around here, bipartisanship, and well, it should be. I hope we can explain what it means to some of the newer members. But as I was talking with Jim McDermott, whose ideas first created this legislation, some of the other side was Mr. Crane from Illinois, that was the co-sponsor. Speaker Gingrich, who was the first witnesser for this bill as I introduced it. And, of course, President Clinton, who took a bipartisan group of members to Africa, not only to help these African countries, but to help American industry and the textile industry. But more importantly than anything, the United States became a symbol of being able to help people not just by handouts, but by teaching them exactly what has to be done. Oh, yes, Jim McDermott's right that when it comes to picking up the pieces and moving forward in terms of expiration dates and people not knowing how to invest. But let's face it, Jim, in today's climate, this is some sort of legislative miracle. And it was completed with the help of Karen Bass, who came here, and she worked the devil out of people on the other side of the aisle. They got so annoyed with her that I had to come in and to let the committee members know that she's new here, but when she gets involved in something that the Senate, the other body, doesn't mean that much. I got a call from Bob Menendez saying it was his idea all along to get this thing through, and we have done it. I do hope, Chairman Camp, that we might snatch what this means in bipartisanship. It may be long and difficult before this session ends to find something else, but I know that those who played a role in this over a decade ago and see that we're moving forward in that bipartisan way with the Foreign Affairs Committee, the Ways and Means Committee, that we all leave here as better legislators. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just have one remaining speaker, so I'm going to reserve. But before I do that, I just want to acknowledge Mr. Rangel's remarks and acknowledge his leadership on this issue over many years. He was at the forefront of making this AGOA agreement a reality, and I want to thank him for that and for all of his hard work over a very long period of time. And at this time, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Joe Crowley.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank my friend and colleague from Washington for yielding me this time, and I want to thank all those involved in bringing this important legislation to the floor and doing it, albeit maybe a little late in some components, but getting it here all the same. And I understand it was not necessarily the House Representatives that was the reason for the holdup, but I am very pleased we're here today. And I also want to make note of the baby steps we may be taking here in terms of bipartisanship. Chairman Camp, as well as my colleagues on my side of the aisle, I think those watching it today may be a little glimmer of hope that more can be accomplished in the weeks to come before the elections. I'm, for one, not necessarily holding my breath, but I want to make that offer that I'm interested in seeing that happen. But even though there are baby steps, it should not diminish the importance of the legislation that we have before us today. And inasmuch, Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of this bipartisan measure. Part of the legislation is a provision that I introduced to maintain the ban on imports from Burma for 1 additional year. Its passage will demonstrate America's ongoing commitment to the advancement of human rights. When I traveled to Burma last January, I was the first member of Congress to officially travel to that country in 12 years. I saw the possibilities for change with my own eyes. I saw the families of political prisoners hoping for a genuine and permanent freedom. I saw ethnic minority leaders expressing the belief that reconciliation was possible. And I saw the tremendous courage of Aung San Suu Kyi, a leader so dedicated to her people that she was undeterred for nearly 2 decades under house arrest. No, she did not demand that this bill be passed into law. In fact, Aung San Suu Kyi has urged a decrease in some international pressure. Can I have an additional 30 seconds?
Yield the gentleman an additional 30 seconds.
Gentleman is recognized for an additional half minute.
Aung San Suu Kyi has urged a decrease in international pressure on Burma. But by renewing this bill today and keeping the measure on the books, even as we are open to new flexibilities, we will help send a strong signal to those in Burma that the United States will continue to focus on the need for the immediate release of all political prisoners and prisoners of conscience, an end to violence against all minorities, including the Kachin and the Rohingya, and the adoption of genuine democratic reform in Burma. I stand in strong support of this bill, and I urge its immediate adoption.
Gentleman from Michigan.
At this time, I yield to the distinguished gentleman from California, such time as he may consume.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was one of the original authors of this measure, along with Jim McDermott and Charlie Rangel. And I know how much work over the last week has gone into this in terms of the work by Chairman Dave Camp, by Karen Bass, and by others who have worked to get this bill out of the Senate. I wanted to make a few observations on this measure and the impact it has had. I chaired the Africa Subcommittee when we passed the African Growth and Opportunity Act. It was bipartisan. It was historic. Before, Africa policy was just aid policy. With AGOA, we created a trade policy for Africa. With AGOA, we have seen exports and imports double into sub-Saharan Africa. And I have had the opportunity to see this program's benefits, hundreds of thousands of jobs, most held by women, created in the apparel sector, boosting very poor countries in Africa. And AGOA has also strengthened the rule of law in Africa, because that's one of the conditions that when we wrote this bill and marked it up, we put that conditionality on, that eligibility criteria. And I just wanted to remind the members for a minute, and this is testimony from Jos Beatty, chairman of the African Cotton and Textile Industries Federation. The eligibility criteria of AGOA compelled most African countries to embrace the rule of law, to allow for political pluralism, and respect democracy and basic human rights. Those were requirements. And the move toward independent judges and an independent judicial system separate of the government in order to enforce the rule of law was very, very important across the continent. And if we didn't act today, because today is the last day, to extend the third country provision, these jobs would have shifted to Asia. And that's what we were told in the hearings that we held on both the House and Senate side on this issue. Already a number of jobs have been lost to Asia because of uncertainty over whether Congress would act. There's a second provision that I think is very important, and that's the South Sudan eligibility. South Sudan became an independent country in July of 2011. And for those of us that have visited South Sudan and have been in Sudan to see the situation, it's very important that South Sudan get this opportunity. Prior to its independence, exporters in South Sudan were eligible for AGOA benefits as part of Sudan. And this legislation ensures that these exporters continue to be eligible for AGOA benefits, very important to the new economy in that new country. Both bodies must act today. Both bodies must do this so that we can put this bill on the President's desk. We have worked over the years, our coalition, with both President Clinton and President Bush. We have traveled to Africa with the former President in order to help sell him on this idea and to sell our colleagues on this concept. And today, with the changes that we're seeing, with the economic growth that we're seeing across sub-Saharan Africa, I think we can be jointly proud of this bipartisan effort. So I think it is a lesson in doing the right thing, and I again want to congratulate Chairman Dave Camp and his staff and our friends on the other side of the aisle, especially Karen Bass, for the flurry of activity over the last 72 hours and with our meetings with our Senate colleagues in order to get this done. Mr. Chairman, I will yield back.
Gentleman from Washington. Mr. Speaker, I yield to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Bass, as much time as she may consume.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you. I want to thank the gentleman from Washington State, Mr. McDermott, for his leadership, and I also want to acknowledge Congressman Rangel for his historical commitment to AGOA. But in addition, I want to thank, as I stand here next to two men who I consider giants in the House of Representatives, I want to thank them for their patience and their guidance with me. And as a new member here, it's been pretty amazing to work with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, Mr. Royce, Mr. Camp, Mr. McDermott, Mr. Rangel, as they all worked with me to make sure that we were able to be here this moment and pass AGOA. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of African growth and opportunity legislation, H.R. 5986. Passage of today's legislation comes as a result of strong and widespread bipartisan and bicameral support. It's been a pleasure to work alongside Mr. Royce in this bipartisan effort, and I also want to thank my friend from the Senate, Senator Coons, who has been a stalwart advocate. I want to acknowledge the African Diplomatic Corps. Thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of African jobs will be saved as a result of your efforts. Mr. Speaker, Africa is on the rise. Today, 6 of the world's fastest-growing economies are in Africa. Opportunities abound, and we see increased political stability. Today's House vote on the extension of AGOA's fabric provision is by all measures a success for the U.S. and Africa alike. But we must not stop here. Let us take a moment to acknowledge this accomplishment, but also prepare ourselves for AGOA's reauthorization in 2015. Africa, a continent of opportunity for too long, has been overshadowed and ignored. While humanitarian, governance, and health challenges remain, we are the observers of remarkable growth and stability across the continent that exemplify positive strides that Africans themselves have made. Africa and its many nations stand on the critical precipice of extraordinary change. Increasingly, Africa's resource mineral wealth attracts investments by countries like China, Brazil, and India. We must, in the United States, increase our investment. We cannot allow our nation to be left behind. Thank you very much. I yield the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields.
Thank you. At this time, Mr. Speaker, I yield to the distinguished chairman of the Rules Committee, the gentleman from California, Mr. Dreyer, who's been active in trade issues his entire career in Congress, as much time as he may consume.
Gentleman is recognized. Gentleman is recognized.
Speaker, many of us have enjoyed saying over the past several years that if we don't shape the global economy, we will be shaped by it. And we also have, as we all know, so much attention focused on divisions that exist in this institution. We know that the media likes to cover pictures, mistakes, and conflict. And obviously conflict here is something that the media likes to focus attention on. Well, here we are, Democrats and Republicans coming together under the great leadership of my friend Dave Camp, the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. We have the ranking member of the Trade Subcommittee. Mr. Brady was here earlier, the chairman of the Trade Subcommittee, working to focus on this notion of our shaping the global economy. As I look over and see my friend from New York, Mr. Rangel, I'm reminded of December 1999. He and I were with President Clinton in Seattle, Washington, at the ministerial meeting of the World Trade Organization. You know, that meeting itself turned out to be an abject failure. The meeting itself was an abject failure. In fact, I'll never forget the week after that ministerial meeting in 1999, the cover of The Economist magazine said, "Who lost in Seattle?" And the photograph was a starving baby in Bangladesh. But the good thing that did emerge from that meeting in Seattle that we attended back in 1999 was the fact that we were vigorously pursuing the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, and we had laid the groundwork, again working in a bipartisan way, to say that pursuing trade, not aid, was the best thing for everyone. Now, Mr. Camp was testifying before the Ways and Means, before the Rules Committee the other day, and we were talking about this issue of a zero-sum game when it comes to taxes. And we also have to recognize that when it comes to the issue of trade, it is not a zero-sum game. It is a win-win for us. And that's why I believe that if you look at all the issues covered in this measure, whether it's the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, whether it's focusing on our great friends to the south, Central American countries and the Dominican Republic, whether it's looking at the area where I'm going to be next week. Next week I'm headed to Burma, and I'm so enthused about the changes that are taking place. We need to encourage that, and I believe that the actions that we're taking here can play a role in continuing to encourage the positive reforms that we are seeing take place in Burma. We're not there yet. That's why we need to take this action, but we are moving in the right direction. And my fellow Californian, Mr. Royce, mentioned South Sudan, the newest country in the world. Last month, I was there when they marked their first anniversary of existence. And this is a country that is seeking to get its sea legs, and I was pleased to be there with my colleague, Mr. Price, who co-chairs our House Democracy Partnership. And we're looking at the idea of possibly putting together a partnership between this new parliament with a very impressive speaker in South Sudan and the United States House of Representatives. And the idea of incorporating South Sudan as part of the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act is, again, an indication that we very much want to strengthen ties with new and re-emerging democracies around the world, not just politically, but commercially as well. And so, Mr. Speaker, I strongly support this effort. I congratulate my friends on both sides of the aisle who are making it happen, and I especially express appreciation to my very, very good friend, Mr. Camp, who has championed this and so many other important issues. And he and I will be together again this afternoon when we get to, I hope, put together a strong bipartisan effort to implement the notion of bringing about real, meaningful tax reform. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Washington is recognized.
May I inquire how much time remains?
Gentleman has 10.5 minutes. Gentleman from Michigan has 6.5.
Does the gentleman from Michigan have any more speakers?
I have no further speakers.
Okay, I'll close and then we'll finish. Mr. Speaker, I want to rise and say that many people played a part in all of this. Nothing in Congress ever gets done by one person. Nothing ever gets done by one side or the other. The good things that happen here always happen on a bipartisan basis, and I'm sorry Ed Royce left, because Ed Royce and I worked together. One day he called me and he said, "Jim, I'm going out to Africa to look at some of the places that the AGOA Act is working. Will you go with me?" I said, "Why?" Well, he said, "I need a Democrat on the trip." That kind of relationship is rare around here, unfortunately, and I think that people need to recognize that it is still going on, that this place runs on trust. Very early on in this session, I said to Dave Camp, "When are you going to bring up the AGOA Act?" And he said, "It's going to come up." And I've asked him many times since, and he said it's going to come up. And I told all my African friends it's going to come up because Dave Camp said it's going to come up. And I am really pleased to acknowledge that he kept his word, because what this place runs on is trust. If you don't trust somebody in here, then you don't do business with them. If you trust them, even if it takes them a long time and you have to poke him a bunch of times, you know that ultimately he's going to do what he said he was going to do. And I want to acknowledge Chairman Camp for that, because I think it is reflective of what can make it possible for us to do tax reform in this House. It is something that took a long time the last time they did it, but it was built on the trust between Reagan and Rostenkowski and Tip O'Neill, and it took a bit of time, but it'll happen if we learn to act on the behalf of the American people. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Well, I want to thank the ranking member of the Trade Subcommittee for his comments, his kind comments. This really was a team effort, and for his leadership as well over the years. A lot of people on both sides of the aisle came together to make this a reality. And I'll just briefly say that this is bipartisan legislation. It does deepen our trade and investment ties with Africa and with the CAFTA-DR countries. That also supports well-paying jobs here in the United States, as well as Mr. Dreyer stated, in other countries. This is not a zero-sum game. This will help both of our nations, as well as Africa. Also, this legislation reauthorizes the import ban on Burmese products, and I urge its passage and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 5986? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Opinion of the Chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended and the bill is passed. And without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentlelady from North Carolina rise?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. By direction of the Committee on Rules, I call up House Resolution 752 and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the resolution.
House Calendar Number 157, House Resolution 752, resolved that at any time that upon adoption of this resolution it shall be in order to consider in the House the bill H.R. 6233 to make supplemental agricultural disaster assistance available for fiscal year 2012 with the cost of such assistance offset by changes to certain conservation programs and for other purposes. All points of order against consideration of the bill are waived. The bill shall be considered as read. All points of order against provisions in the bill are waived. The previous question shall be considered as ordered on the bill and on any amendment thereto to final passage without intervening motion except one. 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the Chair and Ranking Minority Member of the Committee on Agriculture, and 2, 1 motion to recommit.
Mr. Speaker, for the purpose of debate only, I yield the customary 30 minutes to the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Polis, pending which I yield myself such time as I may consume. During consideration of this resolution, all time yielded is for the purpose of debate only. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks.
Gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized for 1 hour.
House Resolution 752 is a closed rule providing for consideration of H.R. 6233, the Agricultural Disaster Assistance Act of 2012. As a lifelong farmer myself, including operating a nursery and being a beekeeper, I can certainly empathize with being vulnerable to Mother Nature and the plight caused by unpredictable weather. Without a doubt, the good Lord has blessed this country with an abundance of natural gifts, and I'm very thankful for America's farmers who work to utilize and protect these blessings to help feed our country and others throughout the world. Unfortunately, the drought devastating so much of the United States this year has yielded a tremendous amount of financial hardships, not only for these farmers, but also for those throughout the rest of the economy that depend on their products. Mr. Speaker, it's important to remember that it's not just farmers affected by this drought. The consequences of this disaster impact all Americans, from those living in the biggest cities to those living in the most remote areas of this country. Not only does drought aggravate the risk of wildfires that have raged throughout the West, but it compromises our crops, which are used to feed our livestock and even fuel our cars. And the effects will last long after rain brings much-needed relief. With the price of corn jumping 50% since June, grocery costs continue to climb. The Department of Agriculture now estimates food prices could climb between 2.5 and 3.5% this year and between 3 and 4% next year. Also of consequence to price-conscious energy consumers is how the drought impacts the price of gasoline. Federal law provides that 10% of gasoline to be composed of ethanol. The increasing price has led some ethanol refineries to cut production, which in turn increases what drivers pay at the pump. While many will suffer from inflated costs of staples they use every day, there are millions of Americans who live in communities throughout this country that are economically dependent on agricultural activity. Many of those living in sparsely populated regions work in businesses that thrive on the income associated with agricultural sales. If anything positive is to come from this drought, my hope is that Americans gain a renewed appreciation for all the different ways agricultural productivity touches everyone's lives every day. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlelady reserves the balance of her time. Gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentlewoman for yielding me the customary 30 minutes, and I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to the rule and the underlying bill, H.R. 6233, the Supplemental Agriculture Disaster Assistance. And look, weather impacts our lives. I'm going to talk a little bit about climate change and some of the driving factors that are causing more severe weather conditions, be they droughts or floods. And yes, you know, they affect businesses, but the solution is not another Republican big government bailout of yet another industry. The Republicans have bailed out Wall Street. The Republicans have bailed out the banks. Now the Republicans are seeking to bail out cows. Yes, Mr. Speaker, another big government solution to another problem in part of their own creation by refusing to take up action on reducing our carbon emissions and for climate change. Look, where does this all end? When it's too cloudy, the solar industry might suffer. Are we going to bail them out? When it's not windy enough, the wind industry might suffer. Are we going to bail them out? You know what? We have restaurants on Pearl Street Mall in Boulder that have rooftop lounges. And when it's too hot, less people go up to the rooftop lounges. We've had a drought. We've had a drought in May and June, and not enough people went to rooftop lounges. I'd like to ask my colleague, Ms. Fox, if there can be government bailout money for those rooftop lounges. And I yield to the gentlelady.
I'm sorry, I don't understand the analogy that you're making.
Reclaiming my time. Reclaiming my time. Okay, so there's just a particular sector. Maybe they have a lot of lobbyists. Maybe they're a big special interest. They own cows. So we're going to bail them out because the price of hay has gone up. That's what we're talking about here today. We're talking about a closed rule. We're talking about a closed process. And this is nothing new, this lack of transparency, this limited debate, pushing through a big government Republican bailout on short notice without even giving members enough time to offer improvements to the bill, to change the bill. The first time that Republicans and Democrats even saw this bill was late Tuesday night. And here we are on the floor of the House without a single hearing, without a single markup, pushing through this bill, shutting out opportunities for Democrats or Republicans to offer improvements to this bill. Look, this is one of the worst and widest droughts we've seen in decades. I see that firsthand in Colorado. We've had devastating fires this summer, coupled with extreme heat in the West. Now, this is indicative of a need to address the true culprit, climate change. The evidence that recent droughts and heat waves are linked to climate change is growing steadily and represents the strong scientific consensus. Now, we need the very conservation programs in the Farm Bill that are being gutted for this big government bailout of cows. The very programs cut by this bill are needed to help farmers and ranchers conserve soil, conserve water, to make their farms and ranches more resilient to the devastating impacts we see from climate change, and to mitigate that impact. Now look, American farmers, ranchers, and environmentalists have all been waiting for months to see a farm bill come to the floor. And now, to the disappointment of many, instead of a farm bill, which I understand for at least 5 weeks we're not going to see in the House of Representatives, we're presented with a cow bailout, yet another Republican big government bailout of an American industry. When the Senate passed their farm bill over a month ago, the House majority couldn't even manage to bring a package to the floor for members to debate. Now, earlier this week, the Republicans were looking at a one-year extension of the Farm Bill and now decided to pull that one-year extension in favor of a cow bailout. Let me once again stress that our severe concerns around droughts in the West and across the country are critical, but we mustn't gut programs that are some of the very programs that can help prevent the impact of droughts in seeking to bail out a particular industry. And when we look at drought assistance funding, we need to have a bipartisan discussion about how we're going to structure it and where it's going to come from, and why certain industries are going to be favored over others. Why is there going to be a cow bailout instead of a rooftop terrace bailout? When it's too hot, businesses suffer. If you're going to have a big Republican bailout, why don't you discuss who it goes to and not just give it to who has the most lobbyists here or who gives the most campaign contributions? Furthermore, the conservation provisions that are cut by this bill do have strong bipartisan support in both chambers. Both the Senate and the House Agriculture Committees understand the importance of the Farm Bill's conservation title. Both farm bills retain funding for the conservation title because many folks on both sides of the aisle agree that conservation practices are critical to protect our soil, the future production of our agriculture, water and wildlife resources. That's yet another reason to consider a comprehensive bill to help ensure the strength of agriculture and protect American jobs, rather than yet another Republican bailout. Instead of voting on the underlying bill, instead of even talking about a 5-year extension of the agriculture bill, here we are today gutting critical programs with bipartisan support to bail out yet another industry with a centrally planned big government solution. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentlelady from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, again, you know, we all grieve for the people in this country who are willing to farm, who are willing to deal with the vicissitudes of Mother Nature and do their best to provide food and other products for the American people and people all around the world. We obviously don't have a lot of control over the weather. We have no control over the weather. We have no control over the climate, basically. But we need to respond to our fellow human beings, our fellow Americans, when there is a need to do that. But the drought would not be as exacerbated and the effects would not be so exacerbated were it not for the overall job climate in this country. We are really suffering from the effects of our colleagues having been in charge of the Congress for 4 years and an administration that is totally out of touch with what is happening not only in this country but around the world in terms of our economic situation. We have record unemployment in this country, Mr. Speaker. We have record deficits. We have record debts. And it seems like everybody recognizes that except for our liberal colleagues across the aisle. We know there's something wrong with the American job climate in this country. Whereas most people recognize the government should not wall off entrepreneurship with oppressive taxes or a costly, overcomplicated, and unnecessarily burdensome regulatory apparatus, we have a liberal president who is so out of touch that he said, if you've got a business, you didn't build that. Somebody else made that happen. Well, it would be bad enough if that was the first Freudian slip from liberal leaders here in Washington. But this comes on the heels of both President Obama and Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid decreeing on separate occasions that the private sector is doing just fine. Apparently, the two highest-ranking Democrats in the country are trying to convince themselves of an alternative reality where unemployment would no longer be a problem if only more Americans worked for the government. Fortunately, we still have a lot of Americans working out there trying to produce food for all of us. I recognize there are many government workers, teachers, police officers, firefighters, who provide critical services to this country. But to suggest that the unemployment problem in this country can be solved by continuing an unending, demonstrably failed liberal spending spree ignores the reality that it's the private sector that generates the wealth which provides revenue for government to work through an increasing seizure of personal earnings, as was displayed on the floor yesterday. Liberal elites would have us all believe that the only way to promote job growth is through a perpetual expansion of special handouts and concessions to government employee unions and politically favored industries. Lest we forget that a centrally planned government-sponsored green jobs revolution was the only solution to unemployment worries during the height of the recent recession. I want to remind my colleague of the Solyndra loans and the many loans in that area that were made that have created crony capitalism in our country. The Liberal Democrats promised to solve these problems by ramming through a $1 trillion stimulus bill financed exclusively by our posterity through deficit spending, and quickly shifted their focus on other crises vulnerable to exploitation, such as a new $800 billion energy tax that sought to crush millions of jobs while sending hundreds of billions overseas, as well as the now infamous government takeover of health care, otherwise known as Obamacare. We're actually fortunate for these striking statements, which reveal a peek into the mystifying mindset of liberal elites who apparently believe that government dependence is a necessary condition for economic health. Well, here's a news flash for the liberals who remain stubbornly unaware of the hardships that continue to grip Americans. The results are in, and everyone else knows that big government cannot simply prescribe economic prosperity and have it be so. With that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves the balance of your time. Gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
I listened very carefully. Yield myself this time as I may commit.
Gentleman is recognized.
I listened very carefully to the gentlelady from North Carolina. I didn't hear her defend this bovine bailout that the Republicans are proposing here today. Now, I'm going to take a few minutes and address some of the mischaracterizations of the President of the United States that were in some of those comments, but then I do want to bring it back to this big government bovine bailout that the Republicans are proposing here before us today. Look, the President understands, and I understand as somebody who started several businesses before I got here, created several hundred jobs, that of course I didn't do it alone. If we didn't have roads that employees could get to work, I wouldn't have been able to start a company. I wouldn't have been able to have any employees to get to work. If we didn't have schools that help prepare programmers and technicians to work in technology companies, tech companies that I started that hired programmers that were good-paying jobs, I wouldn't have been able to start a company. If we didn't have investors and shareholders and the right level of securities regulation to prevent fraud and give them the confidence to invest in companies that I started, we wouldn't have capital formation and venture capital flowing to companies that need it. If we didn't have the rule of law, if we didn't fund our courts, if we didn't invest in basic research, if the government hadn't provided the funding to start the Internet, I wouldn't have been able to start a single company. And most of my friends who are entrepreneurs, who've started companies, who are corporate executives, agree. Yes, the entrepreneur is critical, and the President Jobs Council recognizes that, and this President has been more friendly to entrepreneurship and to business than any president in my lifetime, working to ensure that small businesses have the opportunity to succeed and grow and create jobs in the private sector. But without that basic infrastructure, we have to ask ourselves, what separates the United States of America from a country like Somalia, or even a centrally planned country like North Korea? A lot separates us, but a big part of that is this collaboration of a public sector role that enables entrepreneurship, enables success in the private sector, enables people to create fortunes, enables people to create jobs. That's the proper role of government. Government doesn't stand in the way of job creation. The government policy framework, courts people can trust, roads for people to get to work, good public schools, good health care. That's what enables success. As somebody who reached some degree of success in the private sector before I got here, I agree completely with President Obama that I couldn't have achieved that degree of success without the public infrastructure that played a role in allowing me and so many other entrepreneurs to succeed. Now, moving back to the topic of the bovine bailout that the Republicans have proposed here today, the gentlelady from North Carolina said we have no control over climate, basically. That was her quote that she just said. Well, the vast majority of scientific consensus and agreement would indicate otherwise. Now, we don't control weather, but climate is different than weather. And yes, humans are contributing to climate change through carbon emissions and emissions of other greenhouse gases. The global climate has warmed. The average climate in Colorado now is 2 to 3 degrees warmer than it was a century ago. And it continues to accelerate. Now, that doesn't cause a drought or a flood in any one particular year, but it causes an increased incidence of severe weather patterns that cost us all money, which is why we're even talking about a bovine bailout here today. Now, look, I wish this had come to the floor under an open process. I would have offered an amendment just to talk about it, to say, why don't you bail out rooftop restaurants, rooftop terraces? Look, we're talking about the role of the government, the role of the private sector. I find it ironic and to the point of being bizarre, almost like I'm in an alternative universe, that in the very same remarks that my gentlelady from North Carolina railed against a president who dare to say that the public sector has a role in creating the landscape for private businesses to succeed, at the same time she's advocating for a bovine bailout of a particular industry. Now, why this particular industry? Why not rooftop terraces? Why not solar if it's too cloudy? Why not wind if it's not windy enough? Many, many, many businesses are affected by weather. Retail stores are affected when it snows too much. Should they be coming to Washington clamoring for a bailout? Look, both sides respect the role of the private sector. And when you have government preempting the private sector by picking out a particular industry and elevating it above all others, by giving it government subsidies and a big bailout, you're upsetting the very market forces that the gentlelady from North Carolina espoused support of in another context. This bill today gives us a terrible choice between drought assistance and conservation. Now, both might be worthy, but disproportionate cuts to conservation programs that are used to fund this bill undermine the continuing success of conservation programs that have bipartisan support and are helping farmers mitigate the impact of climate change in their businesses. There are so many other issues of relevance to farmers this House could be taking up. Why aren't we talking about the estate tax, which affects small farmers across this country? If we don't act by December 31st, the estate tax will go to a 55% tax above $1 million in assets, forcing many small farmers out of business and preventing them from being passed down from one generation to the next. Are we going to leave it to the last minute? Is that a plan for the lame duck session? Are the Republicans scared to take on the estate tax before the election? I would advocate that we get down to work and start addressing issues that actually affect farmers. We should be voting to provide for the success of American agriculture, opening new markets, investing in basic research, helping to ensure that families have access to healthy food and nutrition. We need to make sure that farmers and ranchers' needs are addressed. And if we don't address the fundamental drivers of climate change, we're only going to be faced with more and more difficulties, more and more requests from bailouts, maybe cows this time, it may be chickens next time, maybe corn the next time. There's always going to be folks here in Washington, hat in hand, coming to Republicans saying, give us a big government solution. And the question will come to this Congress, are we going to do something about the underlying problem? And whether that approach is through a cap-and-trade system or a carbon tax or incentives for renewables, what are we going to do to prevent farmers in this country from being driven out of business. This bill does nothing. Sure, you can hand them government money, you can hand them taxpayer money. If that's the lack of regard you have for taxpayer money, you want to hand it out to whoever comes to town and beg for it, go right ahead. And, you know, I have some rooftop terrace restaurant owners in my district. Give them some while you're at it. That's not a solution. That's not a solution. That's what got us into this budget deficit. That's what got us into this hole. Let's address the underlying issue of climate change in a scientific manner, have the real political discussions that are necessary to negotiate a bipartisan solution that reduces our carbon emissions, reduces the impact of climate change on American farmers, reduces the incidence and severity of droughts across the United States of America, and also be the global leaders that we need to be on this critical issue. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentlelady from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to inquire of my colleague if he has any more speakers or if he is ready to close.
I'm the only remaining speaker, and I am prepared to close.
Then I would ask the gentleman to close, and then I will close, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, if we defeat the previous question, I will offer an amendment to the rule to make in order an amendment which proposes that Congress will not adjourn until the President signs middle-class tax cuts into law. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to insert the text of the amendment into the record along with extraneous material immediately prior to the vote on the previous question.
Yeah, without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to vote no and defeat the previous question. This will give us the opportunity to renew middle-class tax cuts. When we talk about job creation, when we talk about growing our economy, the need to make sure that we don't increase taxes on the middle class during a recession is something economists from both sides of the aisle agree on, something Democrats agree on. I hope Republicans agree, too, that we shouldn't raise taxes on at least 98% of Americans. Then let's have the discussion about the other 2%. But let's agree on what we agree on. Let's not raise taxes on 98% of American families before Congress goes on break, before the Republicans send us all home to enjoy our summers. Let's do something about jobs. Let's do something about the economy. And let's demand that we can give the middle-class families across America the surety and the security to know that they're not going to need to pay an additional $1,000 a year next year in taxes. They're not going to need to pay an additional $2,000 a year in taxes. I think it's critical, and I call upon my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to vote no and defeat the previous question so that we can bring forward this critical amendment to provide the certainty that America needs to grow our economy and create jobs. I urge a no vote on the rule, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. The gentlelady from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would just say to my colleague across the aisle, I don't understand why our friends can't take yes for an answer. We want to extend the tax cuts that were begun over 10 years ago to everyone in this country. We agree with that, and that's what we're doing. We don't want to raise taxes on anyone. I'd also like to commend to my colleague across the aisle who represents a group of people who only ask for bipartisan cooperation when they're in the minority, a book by the Australian geologist Ian Plimer, who wrote a book called Heaven and Earth, which I think really does do a scientific presentation of what is happening in terms of climate change. And I think last, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to say that my colleague is trying to deal with the chicken and egg issue relative to infrastructure and how does infrastructure get funded. He wants to say that this all comes from the benevolent government, but he conveniently leaves out the fact that the government doesn't create wealth. All our government does is spend wealth and in many cases waste the fruits of hard-working Americans by doing things often very inefficiently. Public infrastructure is funded by the taxes that we take away from hard-working Americans. Entrepreneurs predated the government in our country, and we all know that the Constitution was written to try to establish a limited government in our country so that the entrepreneurial spirit could thrive as it has in most cases. My colleague talks about the government enabling entrepreneurs. Excuse me, I don't believe the government does a lot to enable the private sector. What most people in the private sector will tell you is just get the government out of my way, get the foot of the government off my neck, and I will do just fine. I know my colleague's been in the private sector and created a lot of wealth for himself, and I applaud him for doing that. But most of the people that I know, Mr. Speaker, who are in the private sector would simply say, the government isn't enabling me at all. Leave me alone and I'll do just fine. So, and Mr. Speaker, talk about taking the President's words out of context. As I think my colleague knows, when you put the President's words in context, they're even more disturbing than outside of context. I do believe that our President does believe that the government is the solution, and most of us think the government is the problem. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time. I urge my colleagues to support this rule and move the previous question on the resolution.
Question is on moving the previous question on the resolution. Those in favor signify so by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No.